So I do want to introduce Dr. Mark Buchanan, who's one of our Fair Medicine Fellows who will be moderating the panel. He's a clinical assistant professor of medicine at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. His degrees are from Harvard College and Tufts School of Medicine. Mark's clinical career included primary care, internal medicine, practicing in rural Appalachia, a staff model HMO, and a private group practice, as well as a university practice. He's been a medical director at a large insurance company, statewide correctional health system, serving 20,000 inmates. Mark developed an elective course in medical ethics, and that has formed the basis of several of our webinars, including this one. So I'm very thankful for Mark for lending his expertise here. Before I kick it over to Mark, I just want to say that we've disabled the chat, and for questions that you want the panelists to answer, we'll be doing that around 8 o'clock Eastern time, and we will look through the Q&A section. So please post your questions there. And with that, I will toss it over to Dr. Buchanan.
Well, thank you. And I should say that I do not have a master's degree in medical ethics or anything else for that matter. And my interest in medical ethics came rather late. I spent most of my career just trying to figure out how to do the best possible job, one patient at a time or one group of patients at a time. But like so many people late in their career, the history of medicine starts to sound very interesting, and the ethics of medicine gets more fascinating. And I've developed a sort of a passion to investigate and try to share what I find with medical students. In my elective for medical students, I give them research projects. Some of them are digging back into where they can find eugenics in philosophy, in history, in literature. And they don't have much trouble doing it. You know, in philosophy, it goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, to the eugenic practices of Sparta with respect to their defective newborns, jumping forward to Galton and Nietzsche, and all the way to Peter Singer in our own generation. And then in the literature, you've got H.G. Wells' Island of Dr. Moreau, you've got Huxley's Brave New World, Frank Herbert's Dune, some Harry Potter stuff, and especially that movie Gattaca from 1997. And I recommend that very highly to anybody who wants to see the outworkings of when eugenics is combined with a surveillance state. So we're going to go in three directions in this webinar. The first is focusing on the fairly recent past up to the present, like back 100 years. And this is the period covered by that documentary. I hope that you all were able to see it. If you didn't see it, perhaps this webinar will give you the inspiration to go back and look at it. It's just chock full of lessons for our day. So then we're going to focus on today's situation of what I would call negative eugenics, and finally positive eugenics. What's the distinction? If you think of any characteristic of humans, whether it's intelligence or height or eye color or whatever it might be, criminality, you name it, we are all on a bell-shaped curve. Some people down at the bottom, Einstein up at the top if you're measuring intelligence, and most of us somewhere in the middle. Negative eugenics focuses on the lower half of the curve and asks, how can we eliminate or fix or do something with this? Positive eugenics asks, what about this higher half of the curve? How can we push that along and create Superman, or perhaps just arrive at the Lake Wobegon situation where all the children are above average? This is a lifelong desire of the human race, and we'll try to unpack that. And I'm so excited by this team of panelists that we put together to do this. So here goes. Robert Graboyes holds a doctorate in economics and several master's degrees. He is a Fair and Medicine Fellow president of RFG Counterpoint, a consulting firm in Alexandria, Virginia. If you have not seen his Substack series, Bastiat'S Window, check it out. He explores economics, ethics, health, technology, and culture. His work as an economist has focused on health, ethics, and technology. As a journalist, he got the Bastiat Prize for journalism in 2014. And he's a bit of a polymath. He plays keyboards, writes songs, and entertains people. His doctorate in economics is from Columbia, master's degrees from several places in Virginia that I'm starting to forget. He can give us the details. He worked for the Mercatus Center and the NFIB as a healthcare scholar, and he was an economist for Chase Manhattan, which sent him all over the world, checking out their portfolios and learning other cultures. He's taught full-time at the University of Richmond and part-time at several other universities, and twice was a visiting scholar in Kazakhstan. So a man of many talents. Bob, did I miss anything?
You did pretty well there. So yeah, I've got some masters. I went as an undergraduate to the University of Virginia, and I taught there as well. The University of Virginia happens to have been one of the hot centers of eugenics in the early part of the 20th century. So, which I didn't fully appreciate when I was there as a student, but its reputation lingered there. Otherwise, I've got masters from William and Mary, and I did one in health administration from Virginia Commonwealth University, and a master's that goes with my doctorate at Columbia. So you've got those, and you got my music, and for Chase, I spent a lot of time traveling around Sub-Saharan Africa, which I like to say that's actually where I got my interest in healthcare originally, because it was so radically different. One settled for a lot of things we wouldn't have settled for, and there was also something of an appreciation.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, it's people like you are good for the country's educational system, having gotten about 4 higher degrees. Okay, let's move on to Mark Leach, an attorney from Louisville, Kentucky. His JD is from Tulane. His master's in bioethics is from the University of Louisville. He sits on a lot of boards, including the Kentucky Commonwealth Council on Developmental Disabilities, Down Syndrome of Louisville, where he manages its $2.5 million foundation, and Down Syndrome Affiliates in Action, which is a national trade association for local Down syndrome parent support groups. He's the bioethics specialist for the National Center for Prenatal and Postnatal Down Syndrome Resources. So Attorney Leach has presented at a lot of conferences for physicians, genetic counselors, and parents. And he does have a website called Down Syndrome Prenatal Testing that has all sorts of highly technical but understandable information for parents who are stuck with some uncomfortable decisions. He's got 2 kids, and as he likes to say, his daughter is endowed with Down syndrome and his son endowed with curly blonde hair. As a family, they devote themselves to visiting our national parks and monuments. So how did I do?
You did great, Mark, with the exception that the other foundation members would laugh at the idea of me managing on my own the 2.5 million endowment. They are far stronger financiers on the endowment board than I am, but thank you. And it's downsyndromeprenataltesting.com, which is a site that I'll reference when I talk about some of the numbers that I'm going to present on.
Okay. Terrific. And by the way, I forgot to mention that you also practice law on top of that, and you were with the Air Force JAG deployed to the Persian Gulf. So as they say, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Okay. So Dr. William Hurlbut, last but certainly not least, coming to us from sunny Silicon Valley. He is adjunct professor and a senior research scholar in neurobiology at Stanford Medical School. His undergraduate and medical training were at Stanford, and he then went on to do postdoctoral studies in theology and medical ethics, first with the dean of the chapel at Stanford, the well-published Robert Hamerton Kelly, and then later with the Reverend Louis Bouillet of the Institut Catholique de Paris, and I hope I pronounced that acceptably. His primary research interests involve the ethical issues associated with advancing biomedical technology, the biologic basis of moral awareness, and studies in the integration of theology with the philosophy of biology. He's written a lot of publications on science and ethics, and I can say that I confess I'd never heard of Dr. Hurlbut until a couple of months ago when I got on a webinar where he started to discuss some of the issues that we'll be looking at tonight, and I was so completely blown away by the breadth and depth of his knowledge. So I'm looking forward to what he's got to tell us. So how did I do? You're muted.
Your audience might be interested to know that I served on the President's Council on Bioethics from 2001 to 2009.
And I understand you've been tapped for studies on space biology and some very esoteric sounding things.
Yes, that's been interesting.
So if there's anybody on the panel who's going to give us a glimpse into science fiction and how it comes true, this is the man. Well, great. So much for the introductions. So let's move on. We're going to first call on Bob Graboyes to kind of walk us through the good, the bad, and the ugly, a summary which will in some way reflect on what you all, I hope, saw in the documentary and where he sees our society going in some of these directions. So Bob, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you much, Mark. So eugenics, for those who are just becoming aware of it, was a combination of two Greek words meaning well-born. It was the science of being well-born. Today, we generally refer to eugenics as a pseudoscience, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was considered the height of science, highly respected by universities, by research foundations, by governments, and very, very popular in America with the general public. Eugenicists sought to improve, and I put that in quotes, the human species in the same way that one would improve cattle or soybeans, and using basically the same techniques. Ultimately, in the United States, this quest for improvement led states to forcibly sterilize 70,000 plus Americans, most of them for utterly spurious reasons. And frankly, it's always a danger. It's called Godwin's law about bringing up Nazi analogies. But American eugenics was a powerful inspiration for the Nazi government. And in fact, in the Nuremberg war trials, that was very much brought out. The attorneys for the accused war criminals said, look, here are pages from your own documents in the US. You guys were doing basically the same thing. We just got better at it than you did. And they were not without, they weren't entirely incorrect in that. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, famously said, National Socialism, Nazism, is nothing more than applied biology. And I suspect he meant it, and I suspect he, to some extent, knew what he was talking about. Therefore, to some extent, sometimes I think it is a grave error for us to refer to eugenics as a pseudoscience. It makes it sound like something ancient and antique and quaint, and it's something curious to study, like bloodletting, whatever, but nothing more than that. If you're interested in history, it's great. But in doing so, we let ourselves off very easily. We effectively write the whole thing off as a fluke that, well, it wouldn't happen to us because we're scientifically minded, we're careful. So I prefer, rather than to think of it as a pseudoscience, I tend to think of it as science gone amok. It allowed itself to be driven by the agendas and the prejudices of its founders, It was a scientific community that was utterly intolerant in the extreme of any dissenting views. If you were a scientist in late 19th, early 20th century who had questions about eugenics, you dared not speak up because you would do so at the risk of your career. And I'll add that such dynamics are not unknown in our own time. So when we look at eugenics, if we look at it at all, I think we make three terribly erroneous assumptions. One, we assume these weren't real scientists, that they were just pseudoscientists. Two, that, okay, whatever they were ideological troglodytes, a little more than maybe upper class Ku Klux Klan types. And third, we assume that eugenics is some quaint historical topic that's of no real consequence today. Well, in fact, to a large extent, all of modern science rests on the work that grew out of three brilliant eugenicists. The whole field of modern statistics, which underlies all of modern science, was essentially the brainchild of Francis Galton, Ronald Fisher, and Carl Pearson. When you study college statistics, you are studying eugenics because these are the tools they developed to justify what they were saying. We assume, if you assume that these were ideological troglodytes, you are badly missing the boat. This was, it had support across the political landscape, but in particular, it was a progressive project. Just to name one figure in it, Madison Grant, who was perhaps the worst of them. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race that Hitler described as his Bible. He founded the Bronx Zoo. He founded the Save the Redwoods League. He founded Denali National Park. He essentially was the founder of the whole field of wildlife management. He went to Yale, undergraduate, Columbia Law. He was a brilliant man, well-connected, and very comfortable in progressive circles. And the third assumption there, that this is some quaint historical topic, I always challenged my students who tended to be doctors and nurses and such, think about what you're doing today and just ask, what am I doing today that maybe, just maybe, 100 years from now, my great-grandchildren will be horrified that I was involved in this. And I know we'll talk about it, and I'm going to list some things that I'm not saying they are eugenics or they're terrible, whatever, but they're things that I wanted my students to think about. We're going to talk about Down syndrome. We'll probably talk about Iceland, which is eradicating children with Down syndrome. There are questions of, well, if we can use genetic technology to eliminate autism, ADHD, dyslexia, using CRISPR, whatever, what does that do? How many geniuses in history were somewhere on the spectrum or had those, what we think of as disorders, but they also confer remarkable abilities in some cases. So I don't know what the danger is. I don't know what great-grandchildren will be horrified by, but I know you need to think about it and to be cautious and to listen to others for that reason. With that, I'm going to stop talking and we can move on to discussion.
Well, thank you very much. And I see that you were repeatedly tripped up by Godwin's law, but how could you avoid talking about the Third Reich in a discussion like this? So let me turn to our other panelists for a reaction or for questions, but I will take the sort of chair's prerogative by asking the first one. You come from Virginia. What special pride of place did Virginia have in the eugenics movement?
Virginia was the hot center of eugenics movement. The pivotal moment that launched 50 years really of horrors was a Supreme Court case called Buck v. Bell that took place in Virginia. It was a young teenage girl from bad circumstances who was in a foster home in Charlottesville, Virginia. She became pregnant as a teenager. I think she was 16, 17. And by the standards of Virginia at the time, that was taken as prima facie evidence that she was somehow genetically inferior. Now, the fact is she was raped by her foster parents' nephew. But it was enough for them to send her off to the Lynchburg colony for the feeble-minded and epileptic. I think I've got the title right. And they engineered an awful Supreme Court case where both sides of the case were strong supporters of eugenics and sterilization. Her defense attorney had served on the board of the hospital that was seeking to sterilize her, and they were tight. They had been tight business connections. Anyway, Virginia succeeded in this case. And again, the circumstances are, if you read the specifics of how this case was adjudicated, it's horrifying. But Virginia really in the 20th century built itself around racial theories. We had a guy whose name appears at the bottom of my mother's birth certificate, Walter Ashby Plecker, who effectively was the state's chief eugenicist, who devoted his maybe 40 years as head of Bureau of Vital Statistics to building a massive genealogy of Virginians to determine their racial backgrounds and to make sure that there was separation of the races. He would fabricate data. He would suddenly you would get a letter saying, I've determined that you had a Black ancestor 200 years ago, therefore your children are Black, therefore they're out of the schools, goodbye. And the thing about him is, again, Virginia thought they were being very progressive about this. It was enlightened. They were using, he was a doctor. He was very interested in statistics. And, you know, just again, to think that this is ancient, the last sterilizations were carried out in Virginia in 1979. The state didn't bother to issue an apology until 2002. And there are still actions that are having to reverse the damage done in that period that are still ongoing in the state legislature. This was a very long journey and it's not over yet.
Well, thank you. Let me turn it over. Mark or Bill, what comments or questions do you have?
I think it might be worthwhile remembering that this emerged from an era of high concern about evolutionary process of survival of the fittest, the rise of medicine, and concerns about the dysgenic effect, the weakening of the human gene pool by keeping people alive with modern medicine who would otherwise have not reproduced. And that was part of the motivation, which is one of the reasons that it managed to corral in so many otherwise good people. And maybe you can say a word about this, because I think that, among other things, there was a misunderstanding of early genetic studies. Mendel's studies seem to indicate a very high correlation between apparent genes and traits, which is a somewhat of a misunderstanding. And there's a historical context for all this that helps us understand why this wasn't exactly a pseudoscience. It was just bad science at the time, or rather incomplete science at the time.
Yes, no, absolutely. So originally this all started in Britain. Galton, you mentioned evolution. Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin. He, again, if you've studied any statistics, all the stuff you study in your early statistics were inventions of these three people. The 5% rule, the normal distribution, regression to the mean, chi-squared test, the F test, all of them they were developed for eugenics. These three, like their colleagues there, were snobs and they were racists. And there's no other way to put it if you look at it. And they built a science around confirmation bias. They had in mind what they were going to prove, and they were going to build tools to prove it. And again, a very important part of this was that if you held a dissenting view, you were going to face trouble. This was not let's look at the evidence and think about it. A lot of it they already knew in that time. Anyone who really looked into it could tell they're not really doing the Mendelian science correctly. I'll give you an example. One of the leading eugenicists in America, and in some sense, one of the less offensive ones. He had his doubts about sterilization in some of the extreme cases, but it was Alexander Graham Bell, who for a time held, at least at an honorary basis, the top eugenics position in the United States. Alexander Graham Bell had begun life as a teacher of the deaf. He was married to a deaf woman. I think maybe his mother was deaf. And he had written something on, I forget the exact title, but it was on a warning about the development of a deaf race of mankind, that if deaf people married one another, that you would end up with a whole separate race, and we certainly wouldn't want that. Well, they knew enough at the time to know most deafness was not genetic. His own wife had, I think, probably scarlet fever as a child and lost her hearing. And I used to have some involvement with the deaf community. I did some lecturing for some years at Gallaudet University, and they had a 90-90-90 rule of 90% are born to hearing parents, and 90% of their children are hearing, etc. And there was enough data to already know that that Bell and his friends didn't quite know what they were talking about. And Bell also thought, well, it's okay if they marry, just not each other, because if they sort of marry into the hearing community, the genes will sort of dissipate and dissolve into the distance, which, if you do your genetic charts, that's kind of a nonsense argument. On the other hand, Bell thought the opposite with sort of what he viewed as inferior races coming out of Europe, the Southern Europeans, the Greeks and the Italians, or whatever. You didn't want them marrying into the Anglo-Saxons because it would pollute the whole gene pool. So even if you look at the time, there were geneticists who knew this stuff's nonsense. But again, you did not oppose it. It was extremely popular politically. These were the great thinkers of America in many ways who were pushing this stuff. And you simply didn't want to oppose it. They, confirmation bias is a very, very powerful thing.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, thanks. Before we move on to part two, I will ask Mark, did you have any response to what Bob presented earlier?
The thing I think is most applicable for present purposes is the question that he challenges his students with is, while his presentation was talking about a certain time period, and Alexander Graham Bell is back in the 18th and into the 1900s, it's not locked in. It's not like hermetically sealed to that period of time of human history. When I started studying this, I was shocked at how compulsory sterilizations were still, at least in my lifetime, relatively new from my perspective. I'm sure that we've got some attendees that think 1979 is long ago, but for others of us, it's not long at all. And that's sort of, I just appreciated the challenge that he gave to his students to be aware that this thought process still permeates and can occur.
I'll just note what you said, if I could say one thing, which is California was doing eugenic sterilizations in prison up through, I think, 2014.
Wow.
It's not ancient.
Yeah. Okay, well, this would be a good segue, Mark, then to your portion of the talk. So why don't you take the microphone?
Thank you, Mark. So I don't know about everybody else's personal situation, but Dr. Buchanan alluded to it in my intro that I was sort of born into this issue in 2004 when my daughter was born and happened to be born with Down syndrome. And prior to that, I'd had, like I expect many people, very limited experience of interacting with individuals with Down syndrome. I really was not up on bioethics necessarily at that time. But I rapidly got involved in our local organization, which then got me rapidly involved in the national organization. And 3 years after my daughter Juliet was born was when the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology changed the standard of care. It used to be, up until that time, that prenatal genetic testing for conditions like Down syndrome were only recommended using the terminology of the time for women of advanced maternal age, because that's when there's a correlation between maternal age and the incidence for some what are called trisomies, which is Down syndrome is one of those. I think even the wording is telling that the prompt for ACOG to change its recommendation was a federally funded, NIH funded program that was identifying and developing a prenatal screen that could be done earlier than the second trimester, because up until that time, there was really only the alpha fetoprotein or then the quad test, which is done in the second trimester. And the name of that study was titled the First and Second Trimester Evaluation of Risk, or abbreviated the acronym FASTER, which kind of tells you what the goal of the project was to identify earlier in a pregnancy when a pregnancy may be positive for Down syndrome. So in 2007, ACOG changed the guidelines so that all women were to be offered prenatal genetic testing. But unfortunately, the way that lay people hear that terminology informs how it is understood. And the initial reporting came out as though it was expected. It was a should have testing. And in response, ACOG issued a press release on the eve of the National Society for Down Syndrome Congress annual convention, trying to clarify, because it had gotten a lot of pushback and saying, no, this is all about informed consent. It's all individual choice. And in reporting on the press release, the Washington Post headline writer still wrote, doctors say pregnant women should be tested for Down syndrome. So there's just this sort of normative effect that happens in the common understanding, even when care is tried to be taken to emphasize that this is an individual choice. So how do we get this into the realm of eugenics then? Well, the usual way that most people point to the Down syndrome experience with prenatal genetic testing as eugenic is just in the sheer numbers. You just look at the impact that it has on future generations. My colleague, Dr. Brian Skotko, who is a medical geneticist and pediatrician out of Boston, he and his colleagues take the publicly reported data from countries as well as the individual states here in the United States, and regularly for the past several years update what their estimates are based on those numbers of the numbers that are reported of live births, and then a certain ratio based upon the average age of mothers and a very complex calculation of then how many total pregnancies could be estimated each year in those countries or in the individual states. And then there is a certain percentage of pregnancies that are naturally lost to miscarriage when you are carrying a child with Down syndrome. They account for that, but then there's still a gap between the expected number of pregnancies that would have continued to a live birth, but didn't because of a selective termination following prenatal testing. And so they term that the reduction rate. Well, in Europe, they're quite explicit about this in the countries that have socialized and public medicine, public healthcare. They track and report what they term TOPFA, which is termination of pregnancy for fetal anomaly. They report the total live births and then the TOPFA, those pregnancies that were ended because of fetal anomaly. And from those explicit reports, Dr. Skotko and his colleagues, which I have a post on this at the blog. This is not an ad for the blog. I'm just saying where you can go to find it, which is downsyndromeprenataltesting.com. The reduction rate, like Ireland would be the exception. Ireland only recently allowed for selective termination. And so their most current numbers only have a reduction rate of 8%, meaning that 92% of all pregnancies that are carrying a child with Down syndrome end up having a child that is born with Down syndrome, accounting for those that have natural miscarriage. But on the other end of the spectrum, you've got countries like Italy that have a 71% reduction rate, and Spain, which has an 83% reduction rate. And I believe Bob mentioned Iceland, which was the subject of a recent CBS News report. I believe it was back in the fall of 2021, which talked about how there just aren't children born with Down syndrome, or there's one, maybe three each year that are born with Down syndrome in Iceland. And then back in 2020, there was an excellent article in The Atlantic by a reporter named Zhang that focused on Denmark, because Denmark made a decision in 2004 to offer prenatal genetic testing for Down syndrome. By 2011, the Copenhagen Post ran a headline saying the future could not, there could no longer be children born with Down syndrome in Denmark because of this change in policy. And so that is why the concern about eugenics is raised with how prenatal genetic testing is administered. In the United States, Dr. Scacco and his estimates only show about a 33% reduction rate nationally, but then you break it down by individual states, and like the state in which I sit, which is Kentucky, has a 19% reduction rate, but a state like Maryland reports a 66% reduction rate. And so, but that enough, you have just a numbers argument that, well, it's de facto eugenics because the effect that it's having. But those that would challenge that would say, well, no, there's no state mandate like it was in the eugenics era in America, or certainly in the Third Reich. And this is all the result of individual decisions. And what I've kind of keyed in on is there is a distinction there, or a counter argument to that defense, because prenatal genetic testing, certainly in Western European nations where they have socialized medicine, so it's publicly funded. But here in America, Medicaid covers prenatal genetic testing in every state. There's states like Iowa and California that have state-funded prenatal screening programs. And the reason why they have these programs is the same reason that we talked about in Bob's presentation as what was the motivation for trying to eliminate or reduce future generations. For those who watched the excellent documentary, you'll recall that they talk a lot about the terms like burdens on society or costs to society. Well, that's how all of this subsidization of prenatal genetic testing is justified, either through private insurance or public insurance or socialized medicine. Most pregnancies are not carrying a child with Down syndrome. The incident rate is barely over 0.1%. So how do you justify offering and paying for these screening tests and these diagnostic tests if you get possibly a false positive, to rule that out? How do you justify paying for all these tests that are of pregnancies that are not carrying are not positive for Down syndrome? Well, the argument that is made, and Bob actually prompted me to recall that just in, I believe, 2015, maybe 2014, I was in a presentation at the American College of Medical Genetics, and the then president of one of the newest forms of prenatal genetic testing had a presentation where he was making the case that their testing should be funded because it would eliminate or avoid all these children that would later be born with Down syndrome. And that's where I make the argument that, call it eugenics or call it not, call it modern day application of eugenics, but it has the same justification as what prompted the eugenics movement, which is we are trying to save society costs. We are trying to prevent burdens on society. And so that is how public insurers, private insurers, they have those analyses to justify why they are paying for prenatal genetic testing. And that cannot help but inform then how it is administered, and explains in part the effect of the reduction rate that is so significant in most countries that do so. I believe I've run up on my time on that, Mark.
That was a great presentation. Now, given the controversies around abortion in the United States, there are those who would say it's illegitimate of you to bring in the prior century's eugenics and compare us to what's going on now, because there was a clear moral status of those who were either forcibly sterilized or in the Third Reich actually killed because of alleged disabilities, and the termination of pregnancy where there's controversy over the moral status of the unborn. And I'm sure you hear this all the time. What's your response?
Right, so that's another distinction of, well, there's not state mandatory prenatal testing or decisions following a test result. Then the other, just one of the other distinctions is what you bring up, is that old style eugenics dealt with ex utero lives. Prenatal testing deals with in utero, morally ambiguous status. And there's one argument where, interestingly enough, in the same year that ACOG changed its guidelines, their ethics committee issued a committee opinion that said prenatal genetic testing should not be used for sex selection because they recognize what's been termed the expressionist critique, that by testing for something that then largely results in the elimination of one kind of characteristic, in sex selection it's more often female being selected against the male, that reinforces prejudices and biases. And I have a post called My Daughter's Paradoxical Genes because she has 3 copies of chromosome 21. ACOG says that should be tested for. She also has 2 copies of chromosome X because she's female, and ACOG says don't test for that because that reinforces bigotry. So right. The very same organization that has driven the way that prenatal testing is administered recognizes that there are, regardless of the moral ambiguity of the fetus, it has an effect on the world. And then separately, I would just reinstate the argument that they're not paying for prenatal testing or justifying it because, oh, it's morally ambiguous. From a cost benefit analysis, they're saying we're saving society money, we're saving the public healthcare system, or even if you're in a private healthcare insurer, they make that same justification that by preventing or saving these costs through prenatal genetic testing, we don't have the cost of those lives on the healthcare system later.
Yeah, excellent.
Hey, Mark, can I ask you, if you do a purely mathematical equation here, which is a cold way to do it, but if you did it, would the cost of all that screening exceed perhaps the actual cost of caring for people with Down syndrome?
I'm glad you asked that, Bill, and because that was a point when I was making my presentation, I wanted to make this point that that's another vestige of the eugenics era of how you're factoring the costs of these lives. You have to appreciate that a lot of the cost benefit analyses that are still relied on are very outdated and are coming from an era when an individual with Down syndrome, the standard of care was to institutionalize them. So they were on the public dole from the start, considered a cost from that, whereas now the standard of care is parents accept them home or an adoptive family accepts them at home. They're included by federal law. They're required to be included in public education. There's community supports, and other cost analyses have demonstrated that the numbers that they use to claim this high cost of a life with Down syndrome is informed by either outdated analyses or biased analyses, and are not taking into account a lot of the savings that you recognize with a life with Down syndrome. Since if we're just taking a life to a life, I'm a lot more likely to have a very bad incident that ends up being incarcerated versus my daughter, odds are. But they don't do those sorts of trade-offs in their analyses either.
Yeah, let me jump in with a comment that the cost benefits may reflect self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe that a kid born with Down syndrome can never live independently, can never accomplish anything, will be completely dependent all their lives, well, then that would determine the sort of education and training that you give them. I've seen something very inspiring in my own community. There were 2 women, each of them who had a daughter born with Down syndrome. And one of them was an experienced restaurateur. And the 2 of them said, you know, we ought to start a business that will employ our daughters and people like them. And this is a place where I go to have lunch sometimes. It's called Beans Incorporated. 50% of their staff has some sort of an intellectual disability. And, you know, it's a great place to go. The atmosphere there is so positive. People, the customers meet people who are very happy to be doing what they're doing. And it really brings a sort of a ray of sunshine. And it shows that people can live up to their expectations when you set them higher. So all of that blows up a lot of the cost benefit analysis.
Well, and that leads into a further critique of that analysis, because they use these terms, which I imagine that Bill and probably Bob also are aware of, the QALYs, the quality of adjusted life years. And
Right.
that again doesn't take into account how people with Down syndrome self-report what they think of their quality of life, which is overwhelmingly positive. That's not Mark Leach as an advocate talking. That's been surveyed of individuals with people with Down syndrome that have been reported, their families, et cetera. And I know that there are listeners that are on, because it invariably happens, that thinks that I'm cherry picking data, or maybe other people are just presenting the positive side. That, yeah, just like I think Mark or maybe Bob at the outset talked about the bell curve of human intelligence. Well, there's a bell curve of everybody's capabilities. And there are those people that are going to be employable and working in a restaurant. And there are others that aren't going to be and are going to need to be in a group home or in a assisted living facility. But the same could be said for humans, because that's what these people are. So I don't take those critiques as really undermining the argument that the cost benefits analysis as they are run are inherently biased and incomplete.
Bob, did you have anything to pitch in?
Sure. I was going to say that I used to, as part of my training with them, I like to be provocative, and I noted that the most effective reduction in healthcare costs would be to not have healthcare, because then you'd save a fortune. And obviously you can't do just that simplistic calculus. But yes, a lot of it is QALYs. They have their use in research, but they also scare me, because again, you have a subjective viewpoint of what is quality of life. In the eugenics movement in the 20th century, a lot of it was justified on the basis of, well, let's violate Godwin's law again, because they did it as clearly as anyone. They had a German word, which I always forget, but it's a life not worth living. And we had the same sort of concepts that, well, these people would really want to live, so therefore we're doing them a favor. There's another little movie called The Lynchburg Story. You can find it out there on the web. It's about a 45-minute video. And if you really want to look into the face of it, they had the teacher at the Lynchburg colony, where most of Virginia's sterilizations took place. And he was for 25 years the principal of the school at the Lynchburg colony. And this is, I don't know, after he's retired. And his wording was, well, if you met the criteria, well, you would be eligible for sterilization. And all of his was this very, you're going to be eligible for it. And he makes a statement. He said, this may sound harsh, but I don't think sterilization ever cut the gleam out of anybody's eyes. And you're seeing that it's an attitude where they decide what is a life worth living, which is, what's quality. The same teacher in there says, well, we sterilize them because we decided they really wouldn't be able to manage their money, and they might only be able to pick apples for a living. And I thought, well, if inability to manage one's money is grounds for sterilization, there's going to have to be a whole lot of surgeries going on in America. I mean, but it is this, who am I to decide what your quality of life is? I did want to ask you, I know I've had friends with Down kids who faced enormous pressure during the pregnancy to terminate from medical personnel in the hospitals, and wondered if you had anything to say on that.
Fortunately in our situation, we didn't have that experience, but because of the work that I do with the various organizations that I'm involved with, and because this has been a focus of mine for over 15 years, yeah, unfortunately, I have a great collection of horrible stories of, there's been some surveys that have been published that talk about how expectant mothers will get calls repeatedly from their physician's office saying, are you sure? Are you sure? Because the window's closing. Are you sure? And unfortunately, my profession, the profession that is my day job, bears a lot of blame for that, because we go out, my brethren in the legal field, and will sue doctors, arguing that you cost these parents through your malpractice of not offering prenatal testing or incorrectly reporting the results, their ability to avoid these costs. And there you get these claims called wrongful birth. And it results in the defensive practice of medicine. And while I still, I practice here in Kentucky. Kentucky, through a Kentucky Supreme Court decision, does not recognize that claim, because when medical students go to a medical school, that medical school doesn't know where they will go on and practice. It is permeated in this education that there are these claims called wrongful birth. And I have had OBs here in my presentations in the state say, well, if I don't offer prenatal testing, I'll be sued. I was like, well, it'll be dismissed immediately because we don't recognize that claim. But it demonstrates how it's the same sort of idea with that Washington Post headline that I kicked off. It's just this very basic understanding and the messages that people hear that aren't exactly correct that then end up in the poor administration of it.
Great. Well, this has been very, very informative. I'd like to start quoting people like Frank Stevens and his take on this, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation, because we have not yet heard from our cleanup batter, if I may mix metaphors. And I think we're going to hear some really exciting things, things that make us scratch our head and wonder whether, in fact, science fiction has just landed in Silicon Valley. Because Dr. Hurlbut is very much in touch with people who are doing some very, very cutting edge things. So please take the microphone.
So while I put up my slides here, I want to make a comment about what was just said. Are those, is it come on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I figured out how to get this down.
Do you want the slide? Yeah.
I'm getting there here.
Okay.
Oh, slideshow. Well, that's weird.
There's an icon at the very bottom of your screen. It looks like a screen just below that blue pill. Yeah, right there.
Right there?
Yep.
All right. Okay. I got to go back there. So before we go on, let me point out something from the previous conversation. I heard from a colleague about a medical presentation to donors to a hospital where a woman from the audience asked the question of the panel of physicians representing the medical center, what kind of research are you doing on Down syndrome? And a physician in that setting stood up and said, Madam, the treatment for Down syndrome is abortion. And my colleague was very disturbed by this, and he turned out to be the head of the Department of Neurology at Stanford. And so he started doing work on Down syndrome. And in fact, that kind of work is making genuine advances. And even just within the last few months, there have been some hopeful research findings that suggest that Down syndrome, it can be at least ameliorated and perhaps one day treated to some effect. So it's very important for us to bear in mind in this conversation that medicine is a healing profession, not a sociological filtering profession. And this kind of logic can take us to very dark places. What we need to do is be a profession guided by love and concern for individual lives. In my early experience during medical school, the first time I went in to work up a patient in the genetics clinic, I came out, presented the case to the attending, and he said, something I want to tell you. you need to understand that this individual has the same reason to live as you do, that their life is a treasure to them, just as your life is to you. And I've never forgotten that. And I think that's the way we ought to live, with that kind of love in our hearts. But I want to walk you through some of the interesting implications of advancing technologies, which are at once both positive and negative. It's a little like Moses on the mountain. Today I give you a blessing or a curse. This is a poster for a conference I spoke at Harvard a few years back. And as you can see, it's hands remaking themselves. Human hands, what Aristotle called the tool of tools, are the symbol of our creativity, our comprehension, and our control over nature. And now these hands are turning to the very alteration of our nature. So we're at a very crucial moment. That has been dramatically advanced by recent discoveries in gene editing, most commonly known as CRISPR, which has been described by MIT Tech Review as the biggest biotech discovery of the century. CRISPR is an acronym. I won't explain where it comes from, but it's been compared to molecular scissors, but really it's more rightly like a Swiss Army knife because of its great versatility in controlling genomics at practically every level of its operation. The way it works is there's one part of the CRISPR molecule identifies a stretch of DNA, and another part operates on it as a cutting mechanism, but you can substitute for the cutting mechanism with a lot of other operations on the genome. So it's a very versatile tool. And Jennifer Doudna, recent awardee, laureate of the Nobel Prize, says advances in gene editing are enabling us to rewrite the very language of life, which I think is not an exaggeration. What can we do? Well, with fruit, we can increase nutrition, increase efficiency of photosynthesis, produce laboratory plants that can produce kilogram quantities of drugs. But when it comes to living creatures, especially humans, the effects are more profound and more of concern ethically. And this is most true because we're moving from the era of molecular biology to the era of developmental biology, and the subject of our new wave of scientific inquiry is in the development of how the genes code for proteins, and the proteins interact, and they're the primary actors in human development of any other species. So we're at a critical juncture in human history, which could lead to widely contrasting futures. And those futures will depend very much on our ethical considerations and whether we fall for some of the same concerns that early eugenics did. Unlike earlier gene editing methods, it's cheap, quick, and easy to do, and it's had thousands and thousands of published papers in the last 10 years since its discovery. So we're standing at the cusp of a new era, one in which we have primary authority over life's genetic makeup and all its vibrant and varied outputs. And by the way, I did a 4-year project with Jennifer Doudna to look at the ethics of these matters, and she's quite sensitive to the meaning of her discoveries, which is very refreshing. What can happen? Well, one person made a bunny that could glow in the dark. Scientists have taken out the pigment gene and made albino lizards. That probably didn't hurt the animals. Now that there's possibilities by breaking simple alterations in species barrier, we might one day go to the Dr. Seuss Zoo and see whole new species of animals. But of course, the real concern is with humans. But there's, in the intermediate space, the possibility of human-animal chimeras. This, you'll be happy to know, is just a drawing. But one day we might blend human and other creatures to the level of a disturbing similarity to humans. Already, scientists in China have put human genes into monkeys to try to make them smarter. They gained some things and lost others. 100 years ago, the Soviet Union wanted to produce the human Z. Joseph Stalin wanted to create invincible human beings insensitive to pain, and indifferent to the quality of the food, they'd make great soldiers in the Ukraine today if the Soviet Union were still alive there. Other scientists, serious scientists, want to de-extinction our human ancestors, Denisovans and Neanderthals. That might be possible. George Church at Harvard is working on de-extinctioning the woolly mammoth, and we do have Neanderthal DNA. So who knows where we're going with that one. And then, of course, there's theories that we should alter human genome to make it possible to venture outward into space. And if we're going to go, we probably will need to do something like that. And I guess this is a joke, but somebody suggested we just downsize ourselves so we don't use as much natural resources. On a more serious level, there are significant efforts to alter human beings, basic genetics, to enhance immortality or at least longevity. And this is a very serious multi-billion-dollar effort now in Silicon Valley. Google has Calico, the life science, California life company. They have $1 billion invested in, and Bezos has I think it's called Altos Labs. They're recruiting Stanford scientists at $1 million salaries. One of my colleagues on the President's Council, Francis Fukuyama, wrote a book called Our Post-Human Future, and that has been taken up by a cultural movement in universities like Stanford by the transhumanists, and their symbol is H+. So here's the eugenics ideology taken to the hilt by modern technology. The popular and graceful writer, Yuval Noah Harari, says that sapiens will upgrade itself into another kind of being within a couple of centuries at most. Earth will be populated by beings who are different from us in the cognitive and physical abilities. Well, I actually think for all his cleverness in writing, he's not right on this. I'd like to debate him on this. I think he just doesn't understand the complexity of the science he's talking about. But I don't know everything, and maybe I'm wrong. One thing that does seem to be clear, and that is, as Jennifer says, we may be nearing the beginning of the end of genetic diseases. So this is a very hopeful move. Sickle cell anemia, for example, those little sickles in the shape there, this is a blood smear, should be smooth biconcave discs that roll through the capillaries without clumping. But when there's a little decrease of oxygen, they clump in the small capillaries and veins, and then form larger clots. And I took care of a patient when I was a medical student at Stanford, a little boy, a little African-American fellow who was in for his 200th hospitalization. So it'd be a wonderful thing if we could cure this. And there are others, and by the way, using specially tooled viruses, we can get the CRISPR mechanism and therefore the gene editing tool into obscure tissues, such as the compartments of the brain. So this is a very, very hopeful moment of medicine, and there are at least 6,000 or 8,000 single gene genetic diseases, and 95% of them have not just no cure, but no treatment at all. So, but this is generally considered somatic cell interventions. And of course, what people dream about is getting these genes out of the lineage. So you take a disorder like this, Miller's syndrome, and this one, Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. In this disorder, the children have a metabolic problem and they actually chew their fingers off. If only we could cure these, but that would probably take very early interventions. So that raises profound questions on the realm of positive eugenics. And then, of course, that raises questions about what would be a subject of intervention. Is it worth taking risks to intervene in albinism, or to allow parents to choose eye color or hair color? Well, just the major points I want to make at this moment is that it's not that simple. That things we really care about, longevity, beauty, intelligence, they are caused to the degree that they're caused, which is not direct causation. Genes are not determinative, but they're influenced by many, many genes. In the case of intelligence, at least hundreds, maybe thousands. So there's basic principles in genetics that most people don't understand, especially the journalistic exaggerations where they say we're on the edge of designer babies. Well, those principles are that most genes affect many traits because they produce proteins that interact with other proteins. Most genes affect many traits, and most traits, as I just said, are influenced by many genes. So if you want to change something, you're going to change a lot of things all at once. Now, there may be ways to bypass that, but that means that it's much, much more complicated than people imagine. And we're not on the edge of huge programs of improving humanity. The fact is that it's like paints on an artist's palette. The primary colors are mixed before they go onto the canvas. And that means it's very complicated science. Intelligence, well, not easy. Now, we could maybe give you red hair. That's one or a few genes, but that's an exception. Most traits are going to be very complicated. On the other hand, George Church at Harvard has listed a bunch of traits that he calls rare protective variants of large impact. And here's a list of some of those. These are genes that are rare in the population, but if they were increased, they might be better for the population as a whole. Stronger bones, lean muscles, low odor. I don't know what that's all about, but anyway, maybe somebody wants that. Lower risk of Alzheimer's. Most people would like that. Lower risk of viruses. Yeah. So these will be temptations. Maybe it won't be as simple as it sounds, but you see there are steps into this that one could argue might make it desirable. But as Stuart Newman, a very thoughtful scientist at New York Medical College, says, it won't be easy. Attempts to pick and choose characteristics. Different people have different sense of what's normal, and access to technologies and willingness to take risks will vary. And the definition of what a disease is, you can say, well, we'll just do it for serious diseases. But in the antebellum South, they labeled the tendency to run away from slavery a disease. So we better watch out. And of course, we all know the Nazis labeled just whole races as disorders, disease, and the tragedy of that. I won't linger on the slide. But there are reasons why people want to alter embryos, and that in a strange sort of way is eugenics, all for the purpose of research, and you discard the embryo, but that raises the same sort of questions about embryo selection. What is an embryo? What value does it have? I, for one, think we shouldn't alter human embryos to study diseases, because I don't think embryos should be treated as raw materials and treated instrumentally in our research. I think we should find other more constructive and morally acceptable ways to do this. And there are a bunch of new and exciting ways to do that, these kind of studies of developmental biology. Nonetheless, these are quite compelling arguments. And if we're going to go forward, it's going to be, we're going to have to resist a lot of temptations that are essentially moral decisions. And this comes down to the scientists in China, who I know quite well. I was the American who knew him the best. And he's the guy who did the alterations of the little twins that made so much excitement and condemnation 4 years ago at the, I was there at the Gene Editing Summit in Hong Kong. So I can tell you more about that as if you want later, but he tried to take out a gene, to knock out a gene that allowed HIV to enter cells. He had his own very good reasons for this, but they weren't compelling reasons to the rest of the world community. And I just want to end with this slide, or almost end with this slide. I talked with him a couple of days after the Gene Editing Summit. He emailed me and said, could we talk? And so we had a series of very long phone conversations over the succeeding 6 weeks until he was incarcerated for 3 years. And during one of those, he told me that he'd gotten this email from a fertility clinic in Dubai. And as you can see, they were very eager to take up his gene editing technique. Obviously, they saw there was a huge commercial market in enticing prospective parents to have their genes altered for their coming offspring. So we better be aware that there's a huge human desire for this kind of eugenics, what's been called micro-eugenics, one-at-a-time choices of parents. Of course, the science isn't good, and the moral dilemma you put parents in, even if it were good, is terrible, because most genes would only come through as statistical probabilities of producing traits, producing what has been called the options glut. What do you select for? What do you not? It'd be a terrible, terrible position to put prospective parents in. I, for one, am very glad I didn't have that option. I decided when my wife and I had children, we would accept them for whatever they were and love them with the deep depth of our heart, the way Mark does his child, which is a beautiful thing, in my opinion. But just to close, let me show you this quote from Leo Alexander, who witnessed the Nuremberg trials and wrote the Nuremberg Code. He said it all began with small beginnings. Merely the subtle shifted emphasis, the basic attitude of the physicians, the idea that there was such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. What a tragedy. This is not limited to the Nazis. Francis Crick, discoverer of the double helix. This is a paraphrase, but he said something to the effect of, no new infant should be declared human until it's passed certain tests and its genetic endowment, that it fails these tests, it forfeits the right to live, and he was willing to give the parents 2 years to dispatch their infant. What a tragedy. Voltaire said, what is madness? To have erroneous perceptions and to reason correctly from them. That seems to me to sum up the whole problem with genetics. It's not even good scientists, but it's definitely lacking in ethics, and most profoundly, it's lacking in love. C.S. Lewis once said we should answer all of our problems with more love, not less love, and I think that's the way we should go forward with our biotechnologies.
That was terrific. I'm going to ask one question. Out in Silicon Valley at Stanford, where you live, there's all sorts of innovations going on. You talked about Dr. Hujin Kang. Some of your colleagues at Stanford recently announced that they had taken pluripotential human neurons and injected them into a mouse brain and seen them develop connections to that brain so that they lit up if the mouse was exposed to a light. Now, for some of us, this is sort of reminiscent of a novel by Mary Shelley, and maybe we recoil more from that than we should. Tell us a little bit about the motivations of the scientists who are pushing the boundaries of what is human.
Yeah, that's a fascinating study. I know the guy who did that, Sergio Pasca. He comes to my classes. He's a very nice guy and a very, very smart scientist. And Sergio, what he did was he produced what's called an organoid. It turns out if you take stem cells that you can get not from an embryo, but by inducing their status into pluripotency, taking skin cells or other cells, you can then coax them up to the state of early cells that form tissues in the body, and then cells and organs, tissues, and cells, tissues, and organs. In his case, he produced some of the precursor cells for the development of the cerebral cortex. He mixed them and they self-organize. That's the most amazing thing. Without being in the context of a whole embryo, you can get stem cells to self-organize into specific tissues and organs. He developed this organoid, a cerebral organoid, to a certain point, transplanted it into the brain of a mouse, developing mouse, and it connected in and actually altered the mouse behavior. I consider this to be a moral, at this stage anyway, a moral motion of science. It's the kind of thing we can use to study human development without actually violating the sanctity of human life. And if we are careful not to produce something that is like a Frankenstein entity, if we tiptoe into this and are attentive to the moral risks, I think it's a moral motion, and I think a really, really hopeful kind of science. And I want to say right up front that I think most of my colleagues at Stanford Medical Center, pretty much everybody I've met, is very well-meaning. Some of them are more sensitive, some of them are less sensitive to the implications of what they're doing, but they're really earnest in trying to address very serious issues in human disorder and disease. But we do need very serious considerations, and I agree with my fellow panelists here, historically rooted perspectives to warn us of where we're entering into and where we're tiptoeing into, because it sometimes goes forward for positive reasons and we lose track of the negative potentials. But overall, I'm very favorable to what's happening in the medical center and in Silicon Valley. And I just think we need to pause and consider where we're going. I'm the principal investigator for a major project, multi-million-dollar, multi-year project at Stanford called The Boundaries of Humanity, Humans, Animals, and Machines in the Age of Biotechnology. And we're addressing those questions in a collective interdisciplinary dialogue that I hope will lead to greater wisdom in how we go forward.
That's terrific. Carrie, should you reappear at this point and pull in some questions that our viewers have put out for us?
Yes, I have reappeared. I'm enthralled. What an amazing conversation and presentations. And so to kind of carry thought, we have several questions in the Q&A, and the panelists can look as well. But I think, one question is, with the eugenics movement in the early 20th century that was, again, led by the greatest scientists at the time, so to speak, and supported by associations, what really caused it to turn? I know World War II with the Nazis, but were there things before that were happening? Like, was there debate? Were there people pushing back? And then I guess related to that, someone was asking really, kind of what are some of the guardrails out there now to prevent, things going in the wrong direction? I know Dr. Hobe talked about their work at Stanford, but I'm wondering, I think people are as well, are there things more at the national level to make sure that there's appropriate guardrails in place? So
I think maybe Bob is the best person to answer the first of those questions.
Yeah, so there was always some opposition. Again, they suppressed it, and it was a rather menacing thing to be an opponent. By about the middle of the 1930s, it was beginning to catch on. The Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, was shut down in the late 30s by Vannevar Bush of MIT, who was top scientific advisor to the Roosevelt administration. And it was just a recognition that their scientific methods, their statistical methods, were just awful. And it had just become an internal scandal that you could operate that way. Now, of course, the Nazis gave it a terrible name. But the thing is, the sterilizations did not slow down. They stopped talking about it. If you look at the newspapers in the 20s, it was all full of cost-benefit analysis, and Virginia, how much we're saving in money because future criminals will not be born. They stopped talking about it, but they didn't stop doing it. Finally, it sort of petered out. That's actually a question I always ask my students. Why did it level off here, but it didn't level off in Germany? And my explanation to them, and it was just my conjecture, is because Americans always had a sense of skepticism, whereas German society was trained not to. And so I think that was just part of it, that skepticism here finally caught on.
Let me add a comment here. Apparently, one of the major forces that undermined this notion was the Depression itself, because up until that point, there had been a lot of immigration, but immigrants tended to live in isolated areas within their own culture and language. And there were ghettos. Even when I was growing up in the East Coast, I grew up in a suburb of New York City. There were quite a lot of areas in New York that were principally Irish or principally Italian or so forth. And the people who had gotten to America early had a sense of their superiority somehow because they were wealthier and they seemed more prosperous and they had advantages socially. But during the Depression, everybody was subject to failure. And so people of all different groups found themselves standing next to one another in the breadlines, and they got to know each other. And so some of that kind of natural racism that is a xenophobic kind of natural quality in human nature gave way to a greater understanding that we're all human beings and that there isn't a superior race of genetics. So that was at least one of the contributions to it, as well as a somewhat better science started to emerge, not just statistics, but a deeper understanding that genetics wasn't as deterministic as it sounded from early studies.
And I was hoping that Bill might be able to answer what the guardrails are, since your presentation otherwise had a lot of terrifying images for some of us in it.
What are the current guardrails on it?
What are the guardrails to prevent, the question that Carrie asked from the group was, what are the guardrails to prevent eugenics or eugenical action from happening again in the development of the modern positive eugenics that you talked about?
Well, we're already seeing an enormous amount of parental choice eugenics, because in the environment of abortion on demand, people feel they have the right to filter their embryos either before implanting them in IVF or during gestation, and it's a difficult dilemma, but that's already going on. But I think we've pretty much got historical guardrails in place, at least socially and culturally, against state-run eugenics programs in the United States. But that doesn't necessarily mean those will hold in other countries and maybe not even in our own at some level. So yeah, we've got work to do.
Thank you. And Mark Leach, are you seeing in the advocacy for Down syndrome, are you seeing more groups and more awareness, or are you seeing sort of a shrinking advocacy environment? I'm just curious in terms of that concept of guardrails. Like, is there more and more awareness about this vis-a-vis Down syndrome and all the great as you said, the wonderful lives that these folks can live?
So the efforts that at least I'm involved with is trying to hold the medical community to their own recommendations. That's the challenge of how prenatal genetic testing is administered, is the focus is on the testing and then the decision to be made afterwards. But those same guidelines also recommend supportive resources to help the patient make an informed decision: genetic counseling, accurate written information, referral to your support organization. And since the first conference that I went to in 2007 is where the Affiliates in Action Trade Association started. That really started a group of committed advocates trying to professionalize how support organizations interact with their local medical community, to give the medical community confidence that they can refer their patients to a support organization and use the materials that they provide to them, which we've standardized and acknowledged what were the gold standard. The National Society for Genetic Counselors has an excellent fact sheet on Down syndrome with recommended resources. And so that's at least the effort that advocates at the grassroots level is trying, is in the one-on-one developing of relationships and improving the way that patients are counseled.
Awesome, thank you. Well, there's a lot of great questions. I mean, we didn't get to, Margaret Sanger and, things like that. We will answer the questions at a later time and follow up emails. You can also always email us at events@fairforall.org or medicine@fairforall.org. I'm just gonna throw it back to Mark and give everyone a chance maybe to say a few, closing comments, and then we're at the end of our time. I just want to say thank you again to everyone. This topic is very important to understand the history so we can understand the present and the future. So thank you on behalf of Fair Medicine, and I'll send it over to Mark Buchanan.
There was a question in the Q&A that probably Carrie answered offline, but I want to make sure everybody hears it. And that is, I missed part of this. Can I catch the rest? And yes, give us a week or two, we will have this posted on the Fair in Medicine website, along with the way that you can go back and watch that terrific documentary if you missed it the first time. So let me turn it over to Bob, your last licks here.
Sure. I mean, the guardrail that I would always tell my students is the best thing you can do is to be skeptical of everything you hear, including the sentence I am currently speaking. You know, when you lose the skepticism, you head into dangerous territory, and unfortunately, we live in an age of confirmation bias. You know, social media is bubble chambers. I said at a meeting yesterday, after a press controversy, someone on the web had quoted, and I've not been able to find the quote. It was something from the New Testament that said one should be far more skeptical of information that confirms your prior beliefs than you should be with information that contradicts your current beliefs. So if someone gives you evidence that supports what you already think, look at it again.
Fair enough. Mark, what do you have to close out?
You know, I think the benefit that I certainly have benefited having a daughter since 2004, she graduates and will have a diploma at the end of this spring semester, is the supports that have been developed through our society. Our society has greatly improved in its welcoming nature of individuals with all disabilities, but in my personal situation, specifically with Down syndrome, and to Bob's kind of guidance, as well as the instruction that Bill ended his about every patient values their own life and you should respect that, is if you are being skeptical and if you are being curious and you may not have an experience with the individual with the talked about condition that is being discussed in whatever context you're in, we no longer have the excuse of ignorance. You can find support organizations or a family or an individual or a written resource that is available for you to find that out. And I would encourage you to not go forth and making decisions out of ignorance when you're talking about other humans. Go and talk to those humans and their loved ones.
Terrific. And Bill, you already said a number of wonderful things that would have been perfect for a closeout, but I'm going to give you one more chance.
Well, I think we have to be very alert because we're moving on from testing for just individual genes to what's called polygenic risk scores for complex traits and complex multigenic diseases like schizophrenia. We have ability to detect proclivities toward things like dyslexia or ADHD or variety of things. I just think that we need to, affirming what Marcus said, we need to start to appreciate the diversity of our species. The neurodiversity movement is a very positive movement, I say, and we need to start understanding that human beings come in all shapes, sizes, and manifest expressions, and we need to start understanding the differences that are manifest in our species as an invitation to go deeper into the heart of life. Well, I can't top that. So Carrie, I think we're done.
Yes, thank you. That was
Thanks to our terrific panelists. This has been very instructive.
Yes, and I just want to close by saying the quote of the night: medicine is a healing profession, not a sociologic profession. So thank you everyone, and we'll see you at another webinar soon. Check out our webpage at fairforall.org. Good night.